This happened to my girlfriend and I, who I was dating back in the summer of 2014. It all took place in South Carolina when my girlfriend and I wanted to take a camping trip. We initially tried to go to a place 45 miles from our hometown, but they were going to charge us double what we thought we were going to pay for. We decided to head back, and it occurred to me that there was a spot fairly close to where we live. Now, I will say it's more of an off-grid spot. We didn't have to pay for anything though, and could just park the car and get out. The place is quite gorgeous, and there's a historic bridge and trail, as well as some of the oldest railroad tracks in the south. We got there before sunset, so we had plenty of time to pitch the tent and set everything up. There were a few cars when we arrived, but they were most likely hikers and would be gone by nightfall. The only thing that made us uncomfortable was a busted up and rusted old white van with no license plate. We both pointed that out thinking it was weird, but we shrugged it off and started walking to a good place to set camp up. We spent some quality time together in nature and then went back to the tent and went to sleep. However, we were woken up at around 3 in the morning. We started to hear this obscure singing and walking in the distance. Anytime you hear any commotion that early in the morning, nothing good can happen out of it. I peered my head out of the tent to see what was going on. I didn't see anything or anyone, but nonetheless, I didn't want to stay in that area when we were both freaked out. As we were quietly gathering our belongings, we were sure that we heard the singing get louder. I recall words in the song that the person was singing, including the phrase, "Now won't y'all come out," followed by this raspy laughing. Once we finally packed the tent, we began hearing crunching on the leaves and a humming now, so we knew that this guy was close and had been steadily getting closer. I grabbed my girlfriend's hand and threw the tent and folding chairs on my back. We made sure to run the opposite way from where the noise was coming from. Luckily, we set up camp fairly close to the parking lot because I could see lights through the trees. As we ran, we scurried away from whoever was chasing us, and we noticed the lights from the parking lot weren't just the street lights, but also to our horror, it was the headlights of that old rusty white van we saw upon arrival. We hurried uphill just hoping this guy was alone, as his van was right in front of my car. If he had an accomplice, that would be another person to deal with. As we reached the lot, we got into the bright street lights and we were close to our car. This guy was getting closer, and I could hear the noise of the gravel intensify. I heard this whizzing and him saying, "Don't y'all think you'll get away." As we made it past the van, we split, and I handed her the keys so she could unlock and start the car, and I could throw all the gear in the trunk and we could get out of there. I frantically laid the camping gear in the back seat and got into the driver's seat, hearing every noise this guy was making get louder and closer. With the car running, I kept my head down and put it in reverse, but curiosity got the better of me. I waited a few seconds for the man who was following us to emerge from the trail and into the parking lot. In the brightness of my headlights, we were able to see this mammoth of a man emerge with a stern wrinkled face and red patchy hair. He had a goatee that had dirt and crud smeared all over it. His eyes were fixated on us like a scope magnifying on two 10-point bucks. He barked, "Get back here," as he was waving a baseball bat back and forth. I shook my head, and with that, I swerved out of there and we were on the way out. In the rearview mirror, we saw the man slam the bat in frustration. I've never been happier that I listened to my instincts, and we packed up and left as soon as we heard the singing in the distance, and we didn't wait or ignore it. We drove to a Waffle House and spent the rest of the early morning there until sunrise. I went camping alone in northeast Ohio for 3 nights. I had spent the first 2 nights without incident, enjoying the quiet, the fresh air, and the stars above. But it was the 3rd night and final night that I avoided something horrible, attempted murder perhaps. I woke up at around 3 a.m. due to nature calling, so I got out of my hammock and walked about 10 feet to pee. As I stood there, I noticed a headlamp about 80 to 100 feet away, slowly moving around in the dark. I stood there watching it for about 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The person would stand up, sit back down, and then move a little like they were pacing in place. My instincts told me that something wasn't right. I slipped on my boots, grabbed my hatchet for protection, and started walking towards the right side of my campsite, staying out of sight. I didn't know what this guy was up to, but I was going to find out. I made it about 50 feet from my campsite when I noticed another headlamp, this one about 40 feet away, moving around like the first. It was too much of a coincidence. 2 people, both walking around in the woods in the middle of the night nearby a campsite. This wasn't normal. I dropped to the ground and covered myself with some leaves, trying to stay hidden. The second guy came within 10 feet of where I was laying. He didn't seem to notice me at all. He lit a cigarette, took a drag, and then pulled out a beer. He finished it, then tossed the can to the ground, and after a while, he moved off in the opposite direction. Once he was far enough away, I got up and decided to head back towards the first guy. I got close enough to him that I could hear his phone dinging as it received messages. I crept closer, getting within range to see the screen lighting up with each notification. That's when he stood up and started walking towards my hammock. I froze, laying on the ground again, trying to stay as still as possible. I waited, hoping he wouldn't see me. After a few minutes, I started slowly moving back towards my camp to follow the man, trying to make my way without being heard. I wasn't close enough to see any details, but I could hear the tarp above my hammock getting ripped and trashed. Flashlights flickered, then my own big flashlight, which had been sitting next to my hammock, came on and off in the dark. I heard my mess kit being thrown to the ground, followed by voices. "He was just here," one of them said. I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting for them to leave. After a while, they moved away, and I saw my flashlight's dim light, which they had stolen, getting farther and farther. Once I was sure that they were gone, I got up and started heading back to my site. When I finally made it back, I couldn't believe my eyes. My hammock and tarp were shredded, like they had been hacked with a machete. My mess kit was stomped on, crushed under someone's boot. They took my backpack, rain gear, and flashlight. I was in shock, not sure what to do next. I walked to the spot where I had seen the first guy. I found a few chew pouches, 8 empty beer cans, and a discarded lighter. Then I went to where I had seen the second guy. There I found a bag of powder, which turned out to be meth, along with a pile of cigarette butts, and worst of all, a heap of feces with no toilet paper around. At that moment, I realized how lucky I had been to get out of there without running into them directly. I grabbed what was left of my things and left the campsite, not looking back. I assume those men were very dangerous if they are the type to do meth and walk around trying to potentially kill someone at a campsite. Maybe they were just frustrated that I had left already and they weren't able to rob me for money and cards which had been in my pocket, and therefore tore apart my campsite. Either way, I'm never camping in that area again. My best friend and I try to go camping once a year. We've been doing this since we were 13 years old. I've never really truly been scared or had anything weird happen until last year in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We showed up during peak season, and the first night, space was very limited. We were losing light, so we set up camp on the side of a mountain that was an absolute wind tunnel. When morning came, we went to town, drank beers, and hung out around town until late afternoon. By the time we got back up to the mountains to switch our camping spot, we were losing light again, but we did manage to find a more remote spot out of the wind. We got set up with our tents, got the fire going, and started drinking again. Time went by very quickly, and it was probably 1 a.m. when we saw a flashlight aimed at us, and then the flashlight turned and started walking our way. We didn't really think much of it, and assumed that it was likely a park ranger coming to fuss at us about something, because who else walks up to you in a remote part of the mountains at 1 a.m.? I don't know how other people feel about this, but ever since I started camping, I learned that it's kind of an unspoken rule that you don't walk up on someone camping that late at night unless there's an emergency. Anyways, the person got close enough and we realized that it was just some guy, probably in his 50s, in a shirt and basketball shorts, and his girl who was in her 40s and was avoiding eye contact with us. The man immediately forced a conversation about nothing, did not acknowledge the time of night or his girl, and his eyes were just darting all over the place while we were talking to him. He talked about dumb stuff, like what model or style of lantern we had and how cool it was. He was also talking about how he used to be a former law enforcement officer, completely out of context of the random conversation he had engaged us in. And all of a sudden, during the conversation, he pretended to land his flashlight on our tents and said, "Oh, that's where you guys are sleeping, huh? Cool setup." The way his eyes and flashlight were moving gave us both a feeling that he was trying to see how many of us were there, and what we had on us or near us. His eyes and flashlight scanned the ground around us. We were getting sized up by this guy. For what, I don't know. Once this guy saw his fill of everything around us, he kind of paused for a minute, ended the conversation, and then walked off into the woods with his girl. Once his flashlight disappeared, my friend and I looked at each other, and without saying anything, my friend acknowledged that we should pack up our stuff and move areas, which we did. This was the most unsettling thing that I've ever had happen while camping. I think that guy was going to wait until we were asleep and come back. I just don't know for what. I do know that we were 100% getting sized up that night. It might not seem like much actually happened, but if you ever had a moment with another human being who was sizing you up, you know what I mean. Unless you've been camping, you'll never truly understand how scary encounters like that can be. Back in 2016, my friends and I for the longest time had been itching to go camping to our local camping site in Los Padres National Park in Southern California. When we found the perfect weekend to go that didn't interfere with any of our work schedules, we set the date. 3 days before the trip, we found out that we were going to get hit by a rainstorm. Us being the type of dudes that we are, didn't care if we got hit by the storm while camping, so we packed up our cars and made the 45-minute drive to the campsite. The campsite was a family-friendly one where there were about 100 camping lots that circled around the clearing in the forest. We found the perfect spot that was underneath huge thick trees that would help block as much rain as possible, and it also helped that the restrooms were only 30 yards away. As soon as we got to our spot, we took advantage of the afternoon sky being clear for the moment, and we rushed to set up. The layout that we did was that we pitched our tents close by, where our tent doors were only 6 feet apart. The reason we did this was in order to combat the rain. I brought a 30-foot by 30-foot thick blue canopy tarp that I threw over to cover us from the rain above and from the rain that would be running on the ground. It ended up being perfect for the rainy weekend, but whenever you would walk around the tent, you would be making so much noise from crunching the plastic tarp. Hours passed by and we were all around the campfire. It was late into the evening, and this was the first time that I noticed that there were barely any other campers. Mainly the other people were camping in their RVs. They were the smart ones, unlike my friends and I that were sleeping in 2 small tents, with our only protection from the rain being the blue tarp. I was getting tired from a long day of work, and I decided that I was going off to knock out, and my friends followed my lead as well. The way that the sleeping arrangements were was that I had my friend Ray sleeping in my tent, and Adam and Seth were sleeping in their own tent. Before I called it a night, I whispered to Ray and told him, "I'm going to prank call Seth and Adam, but I'm not going to say anything." Ray smiled as I dialed my friends up. I called them on a restricted number. Ray and I were holding in our laughter as they ignored our call. I decided to do it one more time. They did answer this time, and Seth replied with a nervous hello into the phone. Ray and I had to hold in our laughter as we kept as quiet as possible, not wanting to make any noises that would give off that it was us. I held the phone close to my mouth as I began to breathe heavily in a murderous way. I ended the call, and just hearing them freak out the way they did was fun. They eventually asked if it was us, and after a while, Ray gave in and let them in on the joke. We all eventually calmed down from laughing, and since I fall asleep relatively easily, I was out in a matter of minutes, while Ray, Adam, and Seth were up for a while longer. I was the first of my friends to wake up in the morning, and I had breakfast already cooking by the time everyone else woke up. The smell of me cooking woke my friends up one by one, and they got out of their tents. As we were eating, Adam spoke up and said, "Hey, the prank that you both pulled last night went a little too far." They went on to say that it was one thing to prank call, but then to walk around their tent and go inside of it in the middle of the night was totally off limits. I had no idea what they were talking about, and after some back and forth of questioning and firmly stating no more pranks had been pulled last night, I heard the full story. So, to explain, after I fell asleep, about an hour passed by where Ray, Seth, and Adam were still up. All was quiet in the forest until the sounds of footsteps were heard stepping on our blue tarp that was on the ground. At first, my friends thought that it could have just been a forest animal wandering around, but the heavy footsteps were a dead giveaway that it was a person. The person had been walking all around our tents, making constant figure eights. The person would also place their fingers on the tent fabrics and run them up and down. The footsteps finally stopped after a couple of minutes, right between the doors of our tents. The 3 of them already had their hearts pounding out of their chests. It was silent for a long time, until the sound of a tent zipper being slid open was made. As Adam said, the tent door was only open about halfway, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. But in the darkness, both Seth and Adam saw the silhouette of a man's face pop his head into the tent to look at both of them. Adam and Seth faked being asleep the entire time, but they kept their eyes locked onto the man. The man then opened the tent fully and walked inside the tent, just standing in the entrance. The man didn't say a word or do anything, just watched the both of them laying in their sleeping bags. After the longest minute ever, the man just stepped back out of the tent and his footsteps were heard walking away, disappearing into the night. The entire time that this was happening, Seth and Adam thought that it was either me or Ray doing this as another prank, and Ray thought that it was Adam or Seth doing this. Back to us arguing back and forth at the breakfast table, we were interrupted by a man walking to our campsite, and he greeted us with, "Good morning, boys. How did the 4 of you sleep last night?" This man spoke in a smoker's voice, and he wore a dirty, sweat-stained white t-shirt, and his blue jeans looked as they had never been washed. He smelt like liquor, and his words were all mumbled together. We didn't say a word to this guy, and he asked us if we had any cigarettes to spare him. I told him that we didn't smoke, and he said, "Oh, well, if you boys want to visit me in my RV, just stop by any time." The man continued to walk away towards the restrooms, and as he was done using it, walked back to our campsite. He didn't say anything this time, but he looked at us and gave us a nearly toothless smile, and he walked back to his RV. I took note of his RV, as it was the only RV that stuck out as being dirty and more run down than the others. We quickly summed up the man as the person who was walking around our tents last night, and Seth and Adam now remembered that they smelt liquor from the person who was standing in their tent. We all agreed that we would keep an extra eye out on this guy, and if he did spend another night, we would most likely report him to the park rangers if he tried anything else. When it was around lunchtime now, the man came back, not to use the restroom, but just to talk to us. He started the conversation and said, "So, are any of you boys interested in buying an RV? You can all go check it out right now. Look inside and see if you want to buy it." We told him that we were good, and this time while talking to him, we all responded very simply and sternly. The man seemed to notice this, and he walked away. The man did end up leaving a few hours before sunset, but the entire time that he was there, he kept glancing at us. The man had his RV about 50 yards away from us, and I noticed that he had a restroom right next to his RV. Why did he make an effort in walking all the way over to our campsite to use our restroom? Also, why did he even use the restroom if RVs come with restrooms installed in them? Whatever the man wanted, we were just glad that we were able to enjoy the rest of our weekend in peace after he left. This night I had while camping 4 years ago is the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. This happened when my boyfriend and I were still sort of fresh into our relationship. My sister had recommended to me a snorkeling trip for a fun thing to do with him. It was at this quarry surrounded by a campground that is filled in with water, and it's known for its crystal clear water and its diving. There's apparently a helicopter and a school bus that people dive down to see. My boyfriend and I decided to go camping for the night. So at first it was a really good time. We snorkeled in the shallow area of the quarry, and although the depth of the water was a bit scary, I still enjoyed myself. The water is 65 feet deep, so once you swim out of the shallow area, it immediately dropped off and it was pitch black. This is actually where I realized I'm terrified of deep water. Anyways, it was a fun day, and my boyfriend and I were winding down our night back at our campsite. We were camping in a grassy patch down a hill from the road. Our tent was pitched in a wooded area that our campsite was extended to, and just across the way was a campsite that looked lived in, but our neighbors were out. We were making hot dogs over the fire when the neighbors got back. It was fairly late at night now, and they immediately went to sleep. I'd say 20 to 30 minutes after they got back is when things started to become spooky. My boyfriend and I were chatting when we noticed a dark figure watching us from up the hill. Because of the shadow of the fire, we could not actually make out the characteristics of the figure, but we knew that he was staring directly at us, almost hiding behind our neighbor's truck. He had watched us for what felt like forever until he started walking down the road again. We both watched him in silence, watching him walk behind the trees up by the road. I anticipated each time I'd see him walk forward behind a tree and watch him come out on the other side. He walked behind for a good 4 or 5 trees until I noticed that he had stopped walking. Or was he behind a tree still? I was totally freaked out, wondering where he went or if he was just hiding behind a tree. I watched my boyfriend looking at what happened and thinking the same thing, but he shrugged it off, and I naively did too. We actually ended up forgetting about it and went for a walk to the quarry. It was beautiful seeing the stars reflecting against the water, but the deep and now all black water was terrifying to say the least. We walked back to our campsite, lied in our tent, and I soon began to feel an uneasy feeling which I was trying to ignore. After some silence between us, my boyfriend asked me, "Do you feel like we're being watched?" I said, "Why would you think that?" half joking, but also seriously getting scared. My boyfriend wanted to get out from the tent, so we were standing by my car, and I got this stupid idea that being in the middle of the field that was in the middle of the campground was the safest place to be. My logic being if somebody was going to come up to us, at least we'd be able to see them. So we were in the middle of this field when we saw a similar looking shadow figure from earlier staring at us. We both noticed him while walking, and he was walking in the same direction as us. We changed directions, and so did he. We told one another that if we changed directions again, and the figure does too, that we were going to book it to my car. When we changed ways again, he followed us, and we booked it to the car. I watched from my seat as they slowly walked back into the darkness while staring in our direction. We agreed to leave the campground for the night, but our campground gear was outside still. We quietly got our things together, trying not to freak each other out, but we were very alert. We got home at around 1 a.m., and when I told my father the story the next day, he said he was glad we got out of there or else we could have been murdered. 2 people had died in that campground while snorkeling, which I found out after I got back. I don't know how they died, maybe it was swimming at night in the quarry or something, but my boyfriend and I think that person had some bad intentions and potentially wanted to kill us. They had clearly been stalking us all night, and if they were just there to steal some gear and such, they would have done it when we went on our nighttime walk to the quarry.